Unpopular opinion, but I'm going to share it anyway and say the quiet part out loud. I don't love my mom, and you don't have to love yours either.
You know what's a hard truth? In some families, mothers teach their daughters to tolerate harm in the name of peace. My mother enabled my covert narcissistic father and did not protect her daughters from the abuse.
Why in a black community with black mothers and black daughters, why do the mothers hate their daughter so much? My own mother was a bully. She hated me so much.
There are very few things you're simply not allowed to say out loud. Not because they're illegal, but because they challenge something society treats as sacred. One of those things is admitting that you don't love your mother. The moment someone says those words, the conversation usually ends before it begins. People rush to defend the idea of motherhood itself. But she's your mom. She did her best. You'll regret saying that one day. It's almost as if biology automatically earns someone a permanent exemption from scrutiny. But here's the thing. Nobody blinks if an adult says they cut ties with an abusive partner. Nobody says, well, that's still your husband, or that's still your wife. We understand that relationships are built on trust, safety, and care, not just titles. Yet somehow, when the relationship in question is between a parent and a child, many people stop asking what happened and start asking why the child isn't more grateful. And that's what makes videos like the one you just watched so fascinating. Whether you agree with her or not isn't actually the most interesting part. The interesting part is that thousands of people immediately understood what she meant. Not because they hate their own mothers, but because they recognize something much deeper. That love and emotional safety are not always the same thing. One of the hardest truths psychology has ever uncovered is that children don't stop loving their parents simply because they're mistreated. In fact, it's usually the opposite. Children are biologically wired to protect that attachment almost at any cost. A child would rather believe, something is wrong with me, than believe, the person responsible for keeping me safe isn't safe. Think about that for a second. Imagine how terrifying it would be as a 5-year-old to accept that the person you depend on for food, comfort, protection, and survival is also the person hurting you. Most children simply can't do it, so they come to a different conclusion. If mom keeps yelling at me, I must deserve it. If she humiliates me, I must be difficult. If she seems disappointed every time I walk into the room, maybe I'm just not enough. Those beliefs don't stay in childhood. They grow up with us. They become the voice in our head that apologizes for existing, the voice that second-guesses every decision, and the voice that feels guilty every time we choose ourselves. And that's why conversations like this are so emotionally charged, because for many people, this isn't about anger. It's about grief. Grieving the relationship they needed but never had. Grieving the mother they kept hoping would eventually appear. You see, one of the biggest misconceptions about childhood trauma is that it's always loud. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's screaming, violence, humiliation, fear. But sometimes, trauma is much quieter than that. It's the child who learns that keeping the peace is more important than telling the truth. It's the daughter who slowly realizes she's become her mother's emotional caretaker. It's the son who learns that his feelings only matter if they don't inconvenience anyone else. It's growing up believing that love has to be earned, that acceptance is conditional, and that your worth depends on how useful you are. And if you spend enough time reading through the comments on videos like these, you start noticing something almost impossible to ignore. People from different countries, different cultures, different races, different generations keep describing the exact same emotional experience. Not the exact same events, the exact same feeling. Walking on eggshells, never feeling good enough, feeling responsible for a parent's emotions, feeling guilty for becoming independent. That's what caught my attention. Because once thousands of complete strangers begin using the same language to describe their childhoods, it's worth paying attention. Not because every story is identical, not because every mother is abusive, but because patterns matter. And the next few videos reveal one of those patterns in a way that's surprisingly difficult to unsee.
Why in a black community with black mothers and black daughters, why do the mothers hate their daughter so much? My own mother was a bully. She hated me so much. For what reason, I don't know, and caused so much emotional trauma on their daughters and put so much on their back at an early age. All these responsibilities, all these things, and they get mad when their daughters don't do things that they not supposed to be doing. They want them to do things adults supposed to be doing. Like, and then they favor the men, like the boys in the family, so bad. I don't get it. And then they put all this emotional baggage on their daughters, and then the daughters have to grow up and unlearn all that crap. That is not right. For real. I won't ever treat my daughter like that.
You know what's a hard truth? In some families, mothers teach their daughters to tolerate harm in the name of peace. My mother enabled my covert narcissistic father and did not protect her daughters from the abuse. She taught us to stay quiet, to minimize our feelings, and to look like the perfect nuclear family to others. She also modeled self-abandonment as a strategy to dodge accountability, to gain sympathy, and to control her daughters. Many years ago, I was running my own acupuncture studio, and I had just climbed up on a ladder using power tools, and I was really proud of myself. And I remember my mom looking at me as I was climbing down and looking me dead in the eyes and saying, "You need a man who's going to be doing those things for you." Although I didn't clock it at the time, I realized later on that these kinds of comments and other grievances that she had towards me for being too single, too independent, too adventurous, too loving her life, as it were, they had nothing to do with me. They were all projections of her own shame. The fact that she was divorced, the fact that she was alone, the fact that she had not built a life that she loved. I stayed tethered to her because I wanted to protect her and to take care of her, but I realized being in proximity to her was chipping away at my self-esteem and my power. I'm wondering if you also had a mom that taught you how not to live by example. Tell me about it.
One of the most fascinating things about videos like these isn't actually the videos themselves. It's what happens underneath them. Because if these were just isolated experiences, you'd expect the comments to be full of people saying, "That wasn't my childhood," or "I think you're being unfair." Instead, the opposite happens. Thousands of strangers begin telling stories that sound eerily familiar. Different countries, different races, different generations, different family structures. Yet somehow, they all seem to arrive at the same emotional destination. They describe walking on eggshells, feeling like they were never enough, feeling responsible for a parent's happiness, feeling guilty the moment they started choosing themselves. At some point, we have to stop asking whether these stories are simply coincidences and start asking why so many people, completely independent of one another, keep using almost the exact same language to describe their childhoods. One comment in particular really stood out to me. Someone wrote, "I had to cut her off to find peace." That's an incredibly heavy sentence, not because cutting off a parent is something to celebrate. It isn't. It's usually one of the most painful decisions a person will ever make. But because children aren't naturally wired to leave their parents. In psychology, attachment theory tells us that from the moment we're born, our brains are designed to seek closeness with our caregivers. That attachment isn't a preference, it's a survival mechanism. As infants, our lives literally depend on the people raising us, which means most children will tolerate an astonishing amount of emotional pain just to preserve that bond. They'll make excuses. They'll minimize what happened. They'll convince themselves that things weren't really that bad. So, when an adult eventually reaches the point where distance feels safer than closeness, that decision rarely comes from one argument or one bad holiday dinner. It's usually the end of a very long psychological journey. Another comment said, "I always wondered what it would be like to have a mom I could admire." That one stayed with me. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's so heartbreakingly simple. Most children don't spend their early years wishing they could escape their parents. They spend them desperately trying to make their parents proud. They want to hear, "I'm proud of you." They want to feel safe enough to run home with good news. They want to believe the person cheering the loudest for them is the person who raised them. So when someone reaches adulthood grieving a relationship they never really had, they're mourning something incredibly complicated. They're grieving someone who's still alive. That's a unique kind of loss because there's no funeral, no clear ending, no moment where everyone gathers around and acknowledges your pain. The relationship simply never became what you hoped it would become. Something else began jumping out at me as I watched these TikToks back to back. Notice how often success itself seems to become a source of tension. In the second video, the creator talks about proudly using power tools and renovating her own business. Instead of celebrating her confidence, her mother immediately tells her she needs a man to do those things for her. On the surface, that might sound like an old-fashioned opinion, but when she reflects on it years later, she realizes it wasn't really about the latter or the tools at all. It was about what her independence represented. Her confidence had unintentionally become a mirror, reflecting back a life her mother wished she'd had. Psychology has a word for this. It's called projection. Projection doesn't simply mean blaming someone else for your problems. At its core, projection is when feelings that are too uncomfortable to face within ourselves get displaced onto another person. Instead of sitting with our own regret, shame, disappointment, or insecurity, we unconsciously locate those feelings somewhere outside ourselves. And sometimes, the people closest to us become the easiest place to put them. Now, it's important to be careful here. Not every critical parent is projecting. Human relationships are far too complicated for explanations that neat. But what makes these stories so compelling is that the creators themselves aren't describing isolated criticisms. They're describing lifelong patterns where their confidence, independence, or happiness consistently seem to trigger negative reactions. And when you combine those stories with the comments underneath, you begin noticing the same theme appearing over and over again. People saying, "She projected all her failures onto me." Others saying, "I spent years carrying emotions that were never mine to carry." These aren't people who know each other. They're simply describing the same emotional experience using remarkably similar language.
And maybe that's why these comment sections feel so different from most places on the internet. They don't read like arguments. They read like people finally finding words for something they've struggled to explain their entire lives. Sometimes validation isn't someone telling you what happened was wrong. Sometimes it's realizing that thousands of other people independently experience something so similar that they can finish your sentence before you've even written it. That doesn't automatically prove every interpretation is correct, and it certainly doesn't mean every difficult mother fits into the same category. But it does tell us something important. When thousands of strangers repeatedly describe the same emotional patterns, it's worth paying attention. But these next two videos take the conversation even further, because they introduce an uncomfortable possibility that many people spend years resisting. What if the criticism was never really about your choices? What if it was about what your choices represented? And if that's true, why do some parents seem to feel threatened, not by their children's failures, but by their children's growth?
I do not know who needs to hear this, and I know that this might be a really hard pill to swallow, and these are my thoughts, okay? But I think that as women, the weapon that has been fashioned against us is not a man. Most of the time, majority of the time, I think that the weapon fashioned against us is our own mothers, okay? But we are so deep in Stockholm syndrome that we cannot see it. Yes, she loves you, but misery also loves company, especially if you have a mom who did not attain or acquire the things in life that she wanted. She got the shitty husband. She wasn't able to really progress far in her education or work. Like, she may not have as many friends, and et cetera, whatever the case may be. She is going to look at you in your life, and she is going to bring you down to her level because you have become a mirror to her faults or her dysfunctions or her failures. And the only way that you are truly going to elevate in this life is if you put some distance between you and that lady.
My misogynistic mother was my first hater, and she will always be my biggest hater. Everything that I accomplish in my life is in spite of the voice that she implanted in my head since I was a very young girl. I remember being around 6 years old and overhearing my mom constantly telling other adults around that you could tell from a really young age if the kid is a leader or a follower, and that I was not ever a leader, and that I didn't have a leader bone in me, and that I was clearly just a follower and I was not a leader like her. that I didn't have a strong personality like she did. She was constantly comparing her childhood self, her teenage self, her young adult self to whatever phase of life that I am in. She has always compared herself at that point to me ever since I was a little child. However, whenever I received achievements, she was always in the front row to celebrate me, to take a picture with me and my awards, and to take credit for my own accomplishments. But behind closed doors, she was always putting me down. Get a little emotional. But despite the fact that I grew up hearing that I wasn't a leader, I proved to myself every day that I am a leader. I'm a teacher, a teaching assistant at college. And I do think I do a pretty good job. And I, have been making content on the internet exposing like my life for, I don't even know how long at this point, 4 years. And I think it takes a lot of bravery. I'm writing my book. I'm writing things that I never thought I'd be able to speak about. Because I didn't grow up with a voice in my home. And so this is your sign that you can absolutely rewire that voice in your head that tells you that you're not good enough, even if that voice was implanted by your own parent.
If you pay close attention to those last two videos, you'll notice something interesting. By the end, neither woman is really talking about her mother anymore. They're talking about the voice that stayed with them long after childhood ended. One woman spent years believing she wasn't a leader, because those words had been spoken over her since she was 6 years old. The other realized that every time she stepped into her own independence, she somehow felt guilty for it. Different stories, different families, but the same invisible consequence. The relationship may have changed, the distance may have changed, but the internal conversation kept going. One of the most profound things psychology has taught us is that the way we're spoken to as children eventually becomes the way we speak to ourselves. Think about it. None of us are born with an inner critic. We aren't born believing we're too much, too difficult, too selfish, too sensitive, or somehow never enough. Those messages have to come from somewhere. And when they come from the people we depend on most, they don't just sound like opinions. They begin to sound like facts. That's why so many adults find themselves apologizing when they've done nothing wrong. Why they constantly second-guess themselves before making even small decisions. Why compliments feel uncomfortable, but criticism feels believable. Why success is often followed by guilt instead of pride. The voice may sound like your own, but very often it isn't. It's an echo. An echo of years spent trying to become the version of yourself that felt the safest to be. There's another psychological idea that I think helps explain why so many of these stories sound alike. It's called family systems theory, developed by psychiatrist Murray Bowen. One of its central ideas is that families naturally settle into patterns. Everyone unconsciously learns a role. There's the peacemaker, the overachiever, the scapegoat, the caretaker, the invisible child, the responsible one. Those roles aren't assigned on paper, but over time, they can become incredibly difficult to step outside of because the entire family system adapts around them. Here's where it gets interesting. When one person begins changing, the whole system often reacts. Not necessarily because the change is bad, but because it's unfamiliar. Imagine someone who's always been expected to keep everyone happy suddenly starts setting healthy boundaries. Or the daughter who is always told to shrink herself begins speaking with confidence. Or the son who spent years keeping the peace finally says, "That wasn't okay." From the outside, those changes look healthy. But inside a family that's grown comfortable with old patterns, they can feel deeply unsettling. Sometimes that's why people describe receiving the most resistance not when they were struggling, but when they were finally healing, when they started therapy, when they moved away, when they built healthy relationships, when they became successful, when they stopped trying to earn love and started believing they already deserved it. To the person experiencing that growth, it feels like freedom. To a family system built around old roles, it can feel like disruption.
Now, none of this means every parent who criticizes their child is abusive. It doesn't mean every difficult relationship should be reduced to a psychological label. Human beings are far more complicated than that. Parents carry their own histories, their own wounds, their own disappointments. And sometimes those unresolved struggles spill into the people they love most. Understanding that doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does remind us that pain often travels through generations until someone finally decides it stops with them. And maybe that's what I found most hopeful about those last two videos. Neither woman pretended the past didn't happen. Neither claimed the hurt simply disappeared. Instead, they describe something much more realistic. They describe learning to recognize that the voice in their head wasn't necessarily their own. That just because they'd heard something for years didn't make it true. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do, because healing isn't usually about forgetting what happened. It's about learning to separate your own identity from the story you inherited.
Unpopular opinion, but I'm going to share it anyway and say the quiet part out loud. I don't love my mom, and you don't have to love yours either. My mom humiliated me. She made me feel unsafe. My whole life she tortured me. And somehow I'm supposed to respect and love her? Go ahead and judge me. Tell me I'm going to go to hell because I don't honor thy father and thy mother. It's okay. I know who I am.
I just seen a video on my For You page of a girl and her mother had destroyed her freaking room and was sitting there yelling at her, calling all types of bitches and everything else. And when I tell you I don't wish that on my worst enemy, as someone who literally has a mother who is exactly like that, growing up with that shit as a child was so traumatizing. To this day, I don't know how to be regular with people. Growing up in that type of environment makes you very angry, and it makes you not trust anybody. If you can't even trust your own mama, who can you trust? My only advice, if you're going through something like that, get the hell away from that lady. I'm from Florida. I live in Baltimore for a reason. That's all I'm gonna say.
At the beginning of this video, I said there are some things society simply doesn't let us say out loud. Maybe that's starting to change. Not because people suddenly hate their parents, but because more people are finding the courage to describe experiences they've spent decades carrying in silence. One of the most remarkable things about the internet is that it occasionally becomes something no one expected. Complete strangers, people who've never met, who live on opposite sides of the world, who grew up in different cultures and completely different families, can discover they've been carrying the same invisible weight all along. They read a comment written by someone they've never met and think, I thought I was the only one. That doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't tell you what relationship you should have with your own parents. Every family is different, and only you know your story. But what it does offer is something many people never had while growing up. Witnesses. People who can finally look at your experience and say, I know exactly what you mean. And sometimes, that's where healing quietly begins. Not when someone gives you the perfect piece of advice, not when everything suddenly makes sense, but in the moment you realize you were never imagining it. You were never too sensitive. You were never completely alone. There were thousands of other people trying to find words for the exact same feeling. And perhaps that's why conversations like these matter so much. Not because they encourage us to stay angry, but because they help us understand ourselves. They give language to experiences that once felt impossible to explain. And once something finally has a name, it becomes a little less confusing, a little less isolating. And for many people, the first real step toward making sense of parts of themselves they've carried for years. That's really what maladaptive variable is all about. Human behavior is full of patterns that most of us experience, but very few of us ever stop to examine. The beliefs we inherit without realizing it, the invisible rules that shape our relationships, the psychological traps we fall into, the stories we tell ourselves, and the subtle ways our past continues influencing our present, often without us even noticing. This channel is a place to explore those patterns together.
Sometimes they'll be found inside families. Sometimes they'll emerge in friendships, workplaces, schools, relationships, internet culture, or even society itself. But wherever they appear, the goal is always the same: not to judge people, but to better understand why human beings think, feel, and behave the way we do. So, if you're the kind of person who's endlessly curious about psychology, about the hidden forces shaping everyday life, and about the questions most people never think to ask, I'd love for you to stick around. Because every week we'll unpack another pattern, another behavior, another phenomenon that's hiding in plain sight. Until next time, stay curious, take care of yourself, and thank you for spending some time with me here on Maladaptive Variable.